Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. My name is Nathalie Voisin. I'm a research scientist at the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory located in Washington State in the US. And I'm joined today by Klaus Keller, Professor of Geoscience at Penn State University in Pennsylvania, and Yoshihide Wada, a research scientist at the International Institute for Applied System Analysis in Vienna, Austria. Together, and with the support of the scientific community, we present to you this union session on modeling multisector dynamics to inform adaptive pathways. Identifying sound strategies to navigate uncertain future in the Earth systems requires managing trade-offs and synergies across natural and managed systems, including technological and societal dynamics. Understanding and projecting the dynamic interactions of those systems and the associated risk is a grand scientific challenge. This session is designed to review this challenge with a focus on how processes and decision-making interact across sectors. We aim to understand and represent the non-linearities in those interactions as they drive the coevolution of complex systems. This leads us to the definition of a new field. The field of multisector dynamics aims to advance our understanding of the coevolution of human and natural systems in response to environmental, technical, and societal changes and shocks. This session is a call for a community effort in advancing science in multisector dynamics, as we need new approaches, concepts, and tools that can provide the needed bridges across sectors, scales, and disciplines. In order to illustrate the imminent challenges that multisector dynamics could help address, and to provide some example of how multisector dynamics has informed management strategy and advanced science discovery, we have invited 4 prominent speakers today. Dr. Julie Rosenberg is a senior economist with the World Bank Sustainable Development Group. She focuses on helping World Bank teams and clients take climate change constraints and other long-term uncertainties into account in the preparations of projects and strategies. Dr. Rosenberg will set the stage on the societal impact of multisector dynamics, already demonstrating the need to represent complex interactions between human and managed systems to build resilient societies. She will discuss a multi-system approach to revisit resilience in the Caribbean. Professor Taikan Oki is a prominent researcher on global hydrology and sustainability of world water resources. He currently works at the Institute of Industrial Science, University of Tokyo. He is the lead author of the 5th IPCC Chapter 3 on fresh water resources. Dr. Oki is Assistant Secretary General and Senior Vice Rector for the United Nations, supporting management initiatives and science partnership. Dr. Oki's presentation is going to address how regional perception of water scarcity, the tipping points, and opportunities to transition to virtual water markets are impacted by economics. This is another example of multisector dynamics analytics, which further builds our case. Dr. Richard Moss is senior research scientist at the PNNL Joint Global Change Research Institute at the University of Maryland. Dr. Moss' research focuses on the role of human agencies and decision-making on the coevolution of coupled human-natural systems and factors that facilitate or limit interdisciplinary scientific collaboration. He has held several public service positions, including Director of the Office of the United States Global Change Research Program and Head of Technical Support of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. In his presentation, Dr. Moss will go deeper in the conceptualization of multisector dynamics and will address how the community can work together to go to the next steps in needed tools and scientific approaches. Dr. Jan Kwakel is an associate professor at the Technical University of Delft, Netherlands. His research interest is model-based decision support for decision-making under deep uncertainty and developing innovative model-based techniques for the design of dynamic adaptive policy pathways. Dr. Dr. Quackel's presentation provides a glimpse at these tools and approaches on how these tools grow in complexities as uncertainties need to be characterized in resolving the complex interconnections. With this agenda, please enjoy the presentation as we will have a Q&A and an open discussions on multi-sector dynamics scope, vision, and next step. Thank you.
Hi everyone, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to present this work. It is a World Bank report called Revisiting Resilience in the Caribbean, still work in progress, where we are trying to bring together a multi-sector view of resilience in Caribbean countries, bringing together a mix of research, new modeling, and policy analysis. Resilience is a bit of a fuzzy concept, even though everyone uses it all the time. And I think it's because it's really complicated to measure. And one of the objectives of this report was to measure resilience, identify gaps in what countries are doing, and propose priorities going forward. But it's complicated because it's both an outcome and a process. And what I mean by that is that when you're trying to measure resilience, you want to look at the outcome of resilience building, which is the absence of losses during a shock. And in this case, we're talking about natural shocks, natural disasters, and climate change. But it is also a policy and a political process that needs to be regularly updated and revisited. And so in the report, we do two different things. We do a stock take of the literature and all the evidence we have on the impacts of shocks in Caribbean countries. And then we try to put together what we call a traffic light system that would give us an indication of where countries are in the process of building resilience. Now, if I go to the first part, which is trying to measure the impacts of disasters and climate change in the Caribbean, we do it from many different points of view. We look at risk assessments, which usually calculate damages to physical capital from natural disasters, and that's what we call asset losses. But then we also look at the economic impacts for different sectors, and most importantly, we look at the poverty and well-being impacts of disasters, because we have a lot of evidence now from the rest of the world that poor people are the most severely impacted by climate shocks, and that it is the most difficult for them to recover. We also look at past events, because unfortunately the Caribbean has been hit by a lot of big hurricanes and earthquakes historically, and we can learn a lot from those events. We also look at probabilistic risk assessments that have been done in many countries to help disaster risk management and to help governments put in place disaster risk financing. And then we look at future risks that are going to be brought by climate change. And in particular, we look at sea level rise and sandy beach erosion from sea level rise. I will not show you all the studies that we look at, but just my main message will be on the fact that there are big discrepancies between all these different kinds of analysis, and depending on the discipline and the types of events we're looking at. So for example, the numbers that are used the most in the political world are the numbers on the impacts of historical events. And those are usually expressed as damages to infrastructure. So it's damages to a stock, but expressed as the percentage of GDP, which is a flow. And so you end up with very big numbers that are sometimes higher than 100% of GDP. And those are used to push for more action and more international financing on adaptation and resilience. But then if you look at what the economists do, in particular on sector impact assessments you see that in the end, those impacts don't seem to be that big on economic activity. There are some sectors like tourism and agriculture that suffer high losses, but those are usually short-lived, 1 year, 3 years max. And then there are some sectors that actually benefit from disasters. We see a spike in construction after disasters. And so if you look at the macroeconomic impacts measured by impacts on GDP growth, you actually find relatively low impacts of disasters in the Caribbean. And again, short-lived, no more than 1 year and worst 3 years after big events, which is surprising for humanitarians, for example, because if you look at what they're saying, they see very severe impacts on people's health and well-being, on poverty, on social networks, and that is not completely consistent with the macroeconomic impacts that we're seeing in the data. Nevertheless, everyone agrees that risks are increasing, especially with climate change. The modeling we've done on sea level rise is pretty scary for some countries. And so there is consensus on the fact that countries need to build more resilience no matter what. Now, in order to provide a guide and to do an assessment of where countries are for building resilience, we use this framework that comes from another World Bank report that is called the Adaptation Principles, and that was published earlier this year. This framework starts by looking at the foundations for rapid, robust, and inclusive development, because we've seen throughout our work these recent years that poverty reduction and access to basic services like health and water and sanitation is the best thing developing can do to adapt to climate change. But that's not sufficient, of course, and countries need actions in 4 priority areas. The first one being facilitating the adaptation of firms and people, for example, through access to good information about current and future risks and the uncertainty around future risks, but also access to funding and to the right technologies for implementing solutions for adaptation. Another priority area is to adapt land use plans, urban plans, and protect critical public assets and services like infrastructure networks and health and education services. The third one is to help firms and people manage residual risks and the big shocks that cannot be avoided. And this requires early warning systems. It requires adaptive social protection that can support the poorest after disasters through an increase in social transfers. This requires having an insurance market developed and other types of interventions like this. And then finally, ministries of finance also need to manage the macro and fiscal impacts of these shocks, being sure that they will have resources available after those shocks to help the country bounce back. Finally, in order to implement all of this, countries need the right institutions, they need prioritization processes, and they need to monitor and constantly revise plans. Now, I'm going to go very quickly through some of our assessments along these dimensions because this is a short presentation. But just to say that there's high heterogeneity in the Caribbean in terms of the foundations for inclusive development. Some countries are doing well in terms of GDP growth or in terms of management of public finances. Others are not doing very well. Same for human capital. Some countries have good health and education systems. Others are lagging. In terms of the priority area 1, facilitating the adaptation of firms and people, in general, risk information is available in the Caribbean, but it's not publicly available. So there are risk maps, but they cannot be used by the majority. They can only be used by small groups of people, which limits the ability of the population to adapt. And then some countries have an economic structure that's highly vulnerable to climate shocks because they're highly dependent on one sector, and in particular, a lot of countries on tourism industry. And the tourism industry is a sector that's highly vulnerable to climate change impacts, and that will need to adapt in the future, but also countries should try to diversify away from tourism if they want to be more resilient to climate change. On priority area 3, surprisingly enough, given the income level in the region and given the level of risks, the insurance market is very small in the majority of countries, probably because countries are too small to have national insurance markets, so they should probably try to develop the regional insurance market. In terms of adaptive social protection systems, countries are starting to implement these kinds of systems. It's not really operational in a lot of countries, actually in none of the countries, but a lot of countries have done a lot of efforts during the pandemic. So in the next few years, we should see much more efficient social protection systems that can scale up easily after shocks. For priority area number 4, we're looking at macro, fiscal management, and financial issues. I'm not going to go in details. For the financial sector, we find that in some countries it's really exposed to shocks because banks mostly lend to households and the tourism industry, and there are very few safety nets in case of financial crisis. So it could propagate easily to the rest of the economy. Now we can look at the institutional arrangements in place for resilience, and I apologize for the visuals that are not great. We're working on them. First of all, we see that countries are pretty good with national emergency management agencies. All of them have them and they're efficient. However, it's not as good on the coastal management side. Very few countries actually have institutions in place for coastal management, and very few countries have coastal zone management plans. So this should clearly be a priority going forward. Now, quickly, the conclusions from this ongoing work that I think are relevant for this community of multi-sector dynamics, which is a modeling community, is what's missing here are tools to help countries prioritize interventions. And in order to prioritize better interventions, I think we still need to understand better the impacts of natural disasters and climate change impacts, especially at the macroeconomic level, taking into account non-linearities and maybe threshold effects, and trying to see the negative impacts at macroeconomic level. And then also at household levels, it's important to understand better the impacts on health, on social networks, on poverty, etc. But most importantly, there are very few models that actually are able to quantify the benefits from different kinds of interventions. And that's really what's missing to help decision makers decide between putting more funding for social transfers or more for building protection infrastructure. But then, of course, models are not enough. Building resilience is first and foremost a political process. However, I think there's a growing need for a dialogue between scientists and researchers and decision makers on all those questions, because again, it is a very complex multi-sector topic, and decision makers are a bit lost with all the things they need to do and trying to understand all the different impacts of those natural shocks. And so this dialogue is key going forward, and I would encourage scientists to try to work closer to decision makers to understand what are the questions that people are asking right now. Thank you.
Hello, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, everybody. I'm honored to give a talk in this union session of AG fall meeting this year entitled Modeling Multisector Dynamics to Inform Adaptive Pathways. I'm not 100% sure my topic today, multisector analysis on water, economy, and climate change, will fit to this session, but I hope I can contribute somehow to stimulate our discussion afterward. Okay. My background is in global hydrology, and when I think of multisectoral dynamics, the food, energy, water nexus, sometimes referred to as the fuel nexus, comes to mind. As you should know, food production with irrigation requires a lot of water and accounts for the majority of human water withdrawals. Conversely, importing food products using water from the source of export can alleviate water shortages at the destination by not using water from that region, which is called virtual water trade. Hydropower is still the major source of renewable energy. On the contrary, by consuming a large amount of energy, fresh water can be desalinated even from seawater. It is important to recognize that while some energy can now be obtained from food crops as biofuel, at the same time, a lot of energy is required for food production. Such a figure is also presented in the IPCC-R5 Working 2 Assessment Report published in 2014 as a cross-chapter box. There is also a commonality among food, energy, and water in that their availability is limited by area and time, and food, energy, and water must be considered together. However, the amount of food, energy, and water we need per person per day varies greatly. Our daily nutritional intakes are only 81 grams of protein and 82 grams of fat on average worldwide. We use 2 liters of oil per person per day, and for the entire energy on average, the equivalent of 3.4 kilograms of oil only. In contrast, in the case of water, we drink approximately 2 liters of water per day, but it is estimated that 40 to 400 liters of water are used for domestic use and 2,000 to 3,000 liters of water are used for food production. As you can see, food, energy, and water are essential to our everyday lives, but the amount we need varies greatly. This figure compares the unit prices of various commodities in x-axis, including the cost of water storage capacity and transportation over 500 kilometers to the annual quantities produced in y-axis. In general, commodities that are consumed in large amounts, such as water, are much less expensive by weight than those consumed in small amounts, for example, food and electronic appliances. While the prices of agricultural, industrial, desalinated, and tap water are 0.04, 0.6, 0.9, and 1.2 US per metric tons, respectively, the annual average price of crude oil was $778 US per metric ton in 2012. In the category of water, only bottled water, which is priced between $300 and $1,000 US per metric tons, comes close to the price of crude oil. If water is transported by tankers or pipelines, it costs between 0.76 through 1.89 US per metric ton per 500 kilometers. While tap water keeps its low price based on distribution via pipe networks and initial investments, the price of bottled water includes transportation costs by trucks and ships. Water's low price per weight and the cost of transportation mean that it is rarely transported by itself over long distances, with the exception of bottled water. Because of the difficulty of direct transportation, water is an absolutely local resource without a single international market price. As such, the water needs to be not only clean, but it needs to be affluent and provided inexpensively. However, as I have already mentioned, even it is impractical to transfer water, we can transport food which demands a lot more water. In Japan, for example, it takes about 2,000 liters of water to produce 1 kilogram of wheat or corn, and about 3,600 liters of water to produce 1 kilogram of rice. It is estimated that meat requires more water, high poultry requiring about 4,500 liters per kilogram, pigs about 6,000 liters per kilogram, and beef about 20,000 liters per kilogram. This figure illustrates the estimated flows of virtual water exports and imports in 2000 by nation, aggregated into 22 regions worldwide to show net exports between the regions. The figure indicates that North and South America were major regions from which virtual water export flows originate. East Asia, Europe, Central America, and West Asia were the major destinations. Not all this virtual water trade is driven by water scarcity. For example, large amounts of virtual water transfer to East Asia, including Japan, are driven because of their relatively narrow area of agricultural land in this densely populated region. This figure shows water stress conditions in 142 countries and the effects of virtual water imports on agricultural products in 2012. Upper map indicates the countries categorized as having very low and catastrophically low water resources, and the lower map shows the results, including virtual water imports of agricultural products. Imported virtual water was considered as additional water resources in water stress categories, and the countries which change in category are highlighted by heavy lines in the lower map. The results demonstrate that 21 countries were categorized as very low and 15 as catastrophically low. The number of very low countries changes to 19 and catastrophically low to 9 from 15 when virtual water imports are included. We find that the mitigation potential largely depends on the gross domestic product, GDP, per capita of each country, as apparent from this figure. Countries with better finances were better able to mitigate their water stress by importing food. For countries with GDP lower than $700 per capita, which is close to the poverty line of $2 a day, including virtual water imports of agricultural products does not affect countries categorized as catastrophically low or very low. On the contrary, including virtual water imports improved the water stress category for more well-financed countries, including 4 of 6 countries with a GDP between $7,000 and $20,000 per capita, and 5 of 7 countries with GDP over $20,000 per capita. And this figure presents GDP, water resources, and the net virtual water trade related to agricultural products per capita in 2012. Blue and orange represents countries with net virtual water imports and exports, respectively. As can be seen from the figure, net exporters tend to have high GDP and abundant water resources. It is notable to see that there are no countries that have both low GDP and low water resources, lower than the threshold line connecting 10,000 USD of GDP per person per year and 10,000 cubic meter per person per year of available freshwater resources. This implies that a country with low purchasing power and poor water resources cannot exist. Some of you may be wondering what would happen if we evaluate on a finer spatial scale rather than on a country-by-country basis. This figure is the scatter plot of water availability per capita and GDP. PPP per capita analyzed by 0.5-degree longitudinal and latitudinal grid boxes. The size of each circle indicates the population count. By country basis analysis, there were no countries that are both economically challenged and water scarce, as would be denoted by lying below the thick threshold line or within the triangle. However, some 0.5-degree grid boxes do fall below that line. This should be caused by the heterogeneities of water and monetary resources within nations. So where in the world are the economically challenged and water scarce population located that only appear in the final mesh analysis? There are approximately 40.7 million people living in economically challenged and water scarce regions, and such areas are in parts of Northern and Eastern Africa, the Middle East, West Asia, and Central to Northeastern Asia, as can be seen from the figure. People in these regions are at great risk because they experience shortages of available fresh water to grow food and have difficulty purchasing food due to lack of economic power. So let me share the remarks. While it is important to consider the food, energy, water nexus, or the fuel nexus, water is highly distinctive and needs to be analyzed from a multisectoral analysis, not only in terms of the hydrological cycles, but also along with food production, economic aspects, and demographic distribution. Large quantities of water are required, and water must be inexpensive, making long-distance transportation of water economically impractical. Instead, virtual water trade could alleviate water scarcity, and either water or purchasing power is necessary for survival of people and sustainability of nations. So that is I wanted to share with you today. Thank you very much.
Hello, my name is Richard Moss, and I'm a senior scientist at Pacific Northwest National Laboratory's Joint Global Change Research Institute at the University of Maryland. While I regret missing our in-person meeting this year, I'm happy to have the opportunity to give this talk virtually and look forward to the online discussion. The overall focus of this union session is the difficult challenge of managing complex, interdependent, interconnected systems and risks. And lots of different research communities in the United States and internationally are working on different aspects of this challenge. And we have some great examples of this work in the talks, other talks in this session. My talk on exploring dynamics and interdependencies of complex co-evolving systems through a transdisciplinary community of practice is going to describe an emerging open science approach to accelerate research and tools to help understand and manage this challenge. I'm briefly going to describe multisector dynamics research and highlight a couple of examples, and then describe the community of practice and some opportunities for engagement. I note that this is work in progress, and the concepts and approach are still coalescing. I also want to start with an acknowledgement that much of the research described in this presentation is supported by the U.S. Department of Energy, their Office of Science, the Multisector Dynamics program within Earth and Environmental Systems Modeling, Robert Valerio, Program Manager. And I just want to say that DOE is not just a funder, but also a real thought partner in this work. I also want to acknowledge many colleagues and members of the MSD community, the individual projects that are participating in this, for the many insights that they have provided to me over the years, and also to the members of a scientific steering group for their leadership in helping to synthesize and pull this information together, especially Professor Pat Reed at the at Cornell University for his innovation and rigor, but also never forgetting the so what question. So the overall, point of departure is the fact that we have this incredible worldwide exchange of people, goods, money, information, and ideas. It's really amazing and unprecedented, and it's generated incredible benefits, but also controversy within many societies as they debate the implications of globalization. That's not our focus here. What we really want to focus on is the fact that over time, the underlying infrastructure, institutions, including financial institutions and other components of these systems that provide all these benefits, are ever more tightly woven from global to local scales, and this creates the potential for some downside risks. The figure on the right here illustrates the economic, environmental, geopolitical, social, and technological risks and interconnections identified by participants in the World Economic Forum through the Global Risks Report 2020. We don't understand and cannot well control these systems. And this is evident, pretty much now in a continuous news loop of news about events that have been caused by exposure to natural disasters and other shocks, such as cyber attacks and governance failures. These events have huge impacts on natural resources, on manufacturing, on the service sector of the economy, not just on property, but also on lives. And this is what sets up the challenge that's addressed in Jacobs-Haim's 2018 article on the risk assessment of complex systems of systems, needing to understand and thus model the pathway through which one system propagates to other interconnected systems. Making progress on this can serve the goal of reducing risk and helping to increase the benefits of our interconnected systems. So the idea of advancing a framework for multi-sector dynamics research and developing a community of practice came out of a workshop that was held in 2016 with about 100 scientists, largely drawn from programs supported by the DOE program that I mentioned. It also included representatives of other agencies, the Environmental Protection Agency, U.S. Geological Service, Department of Homeland Security, Army Corps of Engineers, and others that sponsor modeling in this space, but also have operational responsibilities for some of these systems. The workshop identified the opportunity to create this shared conceptual framework for MSD research that would enable researchers coming from these different programs and perspectives to better share the tools and insights that they were developing. And what we mean by framework really is this shared concepts, terms, questions, use cases, and so forth. It's an open science approach, not a single model or set of models. Pulling together the community of practice seemed easy enough when we were focusing just initially on the DOE projects, but we realized there was much to learn from others, and the scientific steering group has been doing a lot of reading and synthesis of research from other literatures, and we've really discovered the importance of trying to reach out to these groups, groups including those working on systems of systems modeling, dynamic adaptive pathways, transitions to sustainability, socio-environmental modeling and socio-ecological modeling, two very different approaches, earth and environmental systems modeling, and others. And the community of practice that we're setting up seeks to provide structure and opportunities for all these different groups to collaborate around the challenges of these complex interdependent systems. We've identified some things that a community of practice really needs to provide, including defining the domain of the work and making clear what the focus is, pulling together and providing opportunities that help the community interact and interact regularly and productively, and finally trying to set up approaches for technical cooperation that improve the practice of multi-sector dynamics research, the common approaches and standards that people apply. So the multi-sector dynamic community of practices goals include modeling how sectors and systems co-evolve in response to environmental, technological, and societal transitions and shocks, representing dynamic pathways of societal change across interacting scales and components and uncertainties, and developing data, models, analysis methods that advance science and inform risk management and resilient, adaptive, and sustainable communities. So there's a definite focus on the science, but making sure that we're focusing on the needs of end users as we do that science. By sector, we mean a complex local to global system of systems that provide services and products. And we're not adopting any single taxonomy. And you can see here in the figure that we're talking about sort of consistent with common usage, energy sector, water sector, transportation sector, human health, and so forth. And we recognize that these sectors are made up of many different components that are necessary to bring goods and services to market and get them delivered to people, including infrastructure, the natural resources they draw on themselves, technology, institutions of all sorts, markets, laws, operating rules, and a whole range of actors from individuals to private sector firms to government agencies. And different studies within the MSD area explore different aspects and components of these, but most highlight the role of infrastructure and also incorporate earth and environmental systems and the goods and services that they provide. In terms of the word dynamics, we mean pathways of change within and across sectors caused by a wide range of influences. And you can see here now in the outer ring some of the environmental and socioeconomic factors that can cause shocks or even longer term, kind of longer term slower step rate changes. We also include in dynamics the idea that people are in fact adapting to change and trying to be proactive to improve well-being through activities like dynamic adaptive pathways or transitions to sustainability. And we definitely want to recognize that there can be unintended consequences from some of these approaches. And we hope that the tools and models that we develop enable people to develop foresight to understand that. Across all of this, there's the realization that there's a potential for feedbacks and interactions that lead to unexpected and undesirable outcomes. Our science themes and questions include looking at dependencies and interactions. For example, how do sectors interact across scales, and how do synergies or trade-offs evolve? An area of stressors and uncertainties, what determines key drivers and stressors of uncertainties, and can path dependencies of failure and transformation and tipping points be identified? Coupling and model evaluation and modeling to inform adaptive human actions really kind of focus on our tools, trying to identify, for example, best practices, or when we're working for decision insight, better understanding what resolution processes and entities are needed to represent adaptive actions and inform trade-offs across options. At the workshop I mentioned earlier, a number of use cases were identified. On the left, those example cases related to interconnected complex infrastructure systems, and on the right, just as an example of a stressor, water variability in water supply, and you can see these topics listed here. And I now want to just briefly talk a little bit about some of the representative work in the field, and I'm afraid I'm going to have to do this, all these three studies, it's not going to be a adequate representation of the richness of the work, and I, of course, have to take responsibility for any errors and omissions because I'm describing the work of others. I hope I can do it justice. This first study is an interesting one by Antonia Hajimichael at Cornell. Who's part of the MSD facilitation team, and what she's doing in this study with her colleagues is developing an evaluation framework for water resources models that help understand the causes of water stress for individual users. The study represents a hierarchical system of water rights in an institutionally complex subbasin of the Colorado River for around 340 users and over 1,000 diversion points. They do a lot of simulation modeling, addressing uncertainties in hydrologic demand and institutional uncertainties, and also hydrologic supply. And the results show that vulnerabilities vary really dramatically for different users. And the radar plots in the figure show shortages for a median year and then the worst shortage year for each of these different users, colored by the single most important factor that influences the shortage. For example, irrigation demand, seniority of water right, snowmelt timing, and others. And the paper really underlies the importance of this kind of detailed institutional representation to better understand the actual dynamics in the system. A second paper, which is work by Marshall Wise and colleagues at the Joint Institute that I'm part of, really focuses on trying to develop more power sector detail in multi-sector models. These models have traditionally represented electricity supply and demand in a much more aggregated way, and this work develops a method to better capture investment and operation decisions that would be affected by different levels of load at different times of year and different times of day. And so the study is basically investigating the sensitivity of power sector investments and operations to natural gas price fluctuations. And the method that they develop, the figure shows electricity exports and imports in terawatts in 2030 by state. And the method that they've developed really enables them to do this without adding a lot of solution complexity. This third study, which I'll cover very briefly, is just work by Puya Vamani and colleagues at Lawrence Berkeley Lab, and it evaluates extreme heat risk in cities considering a combination of climate conditions, population dynamics, and building characteristics. They use the Weather Research Forecast model and satellite-derived urban canopy data and a spatially explicit population projection to project how vulnerability evolves under different kinds of heat waves in two different regions of California. And what they represent, the mitigation measure, the use of cool roofs, which can offset a substantial fraction of the increased heat exposure and associated building energy demand that result. So my final points really are going to focus here on the community of practice itself. Our activities include communication with a website and newsletter and a diverse set of webinars, a process to develop a conceptual framework that the scientific steering group is leading and that will involve the whole community, and then kind of coordinating different experiments and synthesis activities through a set of working groups and promoting early career opportunities for early career scientists. We have two broad sets of methodological aspirations. The first, better capturing the interdependencies and interconnectedness that we see in these systems. And second, taking MSD Science Exponential, trying to look at how we improve our models and work together through open science approaches. I won't go into the details of these. You'll see a little bit more when I talk about the research itself, or the working groups themselves, but I'll just note that these aspirations are really made possible by a variety of developments in computation and even in social science, where we're seeing a lot of advances in much finer scale, much more micro level data and analysis. Our technical working groups include three that focus kind of on cross-cutting issues: fair data, making data findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, as well as human systems modeling. And this is kind of looking at intercomparing and evaluating a range of techniques that go beyond kind of standard economic approaches, including agent-based modeling, bioeconomic, and computational general equilibrium approaches. And then another working group focusing on uncertainty quantification and scenario development, exploring how uncertainties affect dynamics and feedbacks, and the use of scenarios in the presence of deep uncertainties. There's 3 thematic working groups as well, one focusing on urban systems, a second on multi-sector impacts of energy transitions, and these enable people who are working on those topics to come together and advance, understand better how these interacting systems affect either energy transitions or urban systems, and how to improve, how to kind of share their resources and improve research. And then a final working group focused on professional development and education for early career scientists. We're very proud that our community is convening and leading a special issue of Earth's Future on multisector dynamics. The QR code here will take you to the landing page. The submission date is open at this point from the 1st of October this year to 1st of October 2021. We really hope that you'll offer submissions to this. I think it's going to be a really great special issue. So in conclusion, I just want to remind you that the Multisector Dynamics community of practice is in the process of coalescing. It's a multidisciplinary collective of researchers based at universities and national labs all across the US, and now we hope increasingly internationally. The community is drawn from a wide range of sciences, natural, social science, engineering, and other researchers at all career stages, and really seeking collaborations with other research communities to provide insights and methodological innovations. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'll be talking about informing the design of adaptive policy pathways in a complex world, specifically about multisectoral dynamics and the value of deep uncertainty methods. And this is work that I've been doing together with Bramka Arga-Javino, one of my PhD students. And I'm Jan Kwakkel. I'm an associate professor at Delft University of Technology. Before we dive into the actual details of the work, I would like to acknowledge, first of all, the funder, which is the Dutch National Science Foundation. And the work I'll be talking about today is done in close collaboration with the Free University Amsterdam, and in particular with Maaike van Aalst, who is doing her PhD there. Here you see a picture that was taken by Bramka when we visited the Vietnam Mekong Delta 2 years ago. It's sort of typical for this area. We see a rice paddy, we see a farmer driving on a small motorbike with some fertilizer or construction material. But as many of you know, the Vietnam Mekong Delta is undergoing rapid transformation and change. And we can see headlines like, for example, this one, that climate change is driving migration from the Vietnam Mekong Delta. And when I see headlines like this, I'm getting a little bit uncomfortable. The climate is changing, and it is having profound impact on what is happening in the Vietnam Mekong Delta. But to claim that a complex phenomenon like migration can be explained exclusively or almost predominantly by climate change, I think is too simplistic. What is happening in the Vietnam Mekong Delta is a complex interplay between a variety of factors that give rise to migration. And climate change is playing a role in that, and climate change is expected to play a much bigger role in that in the future. So this is a nice example of why multisectoral dynamics are essential, and we need to be considered when we study complex phenomena like migration. So first of all, about complexity. The aggregate dynamics, so in this case migration, are an emergent property of interacting systems. So in this case, migration is partly driven by industrialization and economic development, partly driven by upstream dam development of all kinds of dikes within the Vietnam Mekong Delta, also changes in values and what people care about. And to simply say that one single factor explains all of it, I think is way too simplistic, because there are co-evolutionary dynamics between the social, environmental, and technical systems. And moreover, we're dealing with a partially open system boundary. And it's through this partially open system boundary that, for example, climate change affects these co-evolutionary dynamics, and by extension, a phenomenon like migration. But that's not enough. To make matters worse, there's a lot of uncertainty surrounding issues like migration. We don't exactly know the future exogenous environment in terms of climate, socioeconomic factors, what happens upstream in the Mekong. There's also a lot of uncertainty about the exact internal workings of the system. We might have a very, very good understanding of how the natural system works, but how does exactly land use change dynamics work? What drives people in Vietnam, and in the Mekong in particular, to leave their land, to migrate? We don't really know, because it's a really different society with different institutions, different rules, different culture. And that makes it hard to make strong claims about why people do what they do. Moreover, we can have a long debate about exactly what the problem is. Is migration a problem? One might argue that migration is sort of expected and people are pursuing a better life. So is it a problem? Also, migration might give rise to increased productivity due to mechanization in the Vietnam-Mekong Delta. Again, that might be a good development. Related to this, what are the objectives of policy? Should we pursue less migration? Should we pursue economic development? And economic development for whom and where? And finally, there are all kinds of moral principles one might apply here. And one might argue that the goal is to just maximize gross domestic product. But one might also argue, no, we should focus on pro-poor development. Depending on what moral stance one takes, quite different policies would come out as being very, very important. Policy pathways, as developed by Marjolein Haasnoot and others in a paper in 2013, are a broadly adopted approach by now for navigating an uncertain future, driven by complex dynamics. And here you see the sort of metro map style visualization strongly associated with this approach. But how do we design policy pathways, given all the uncertainty and the complexity? How can we use models to do that? Well, that's a problem I'm deeply interested in. And a lot of my work is inspired by a paper out of 1993 by someone called Steve Bankes. And in this paper, he talks about, okay, when we have insufficient knowledge or when there are unresolvable uncertainties, we cannot make a surrogate of the target system because we have to make all kinds of guesses and heroic assumptions at details and mechanisms. We can, however, use such a model because it provides us a computational experiment that reveals how the world would behave if the various guesses were correct. And by making many of these experiments, by analyzing those results, by finding patterns in them, etc., we can use models to design pathways because we are systematically exploring all the uncertainty. And that is basically what we are doing also in the Mekong. To get a little bit more specific for context, we're looking at two provinces in the upstream area of the Vietnam-Mekong Delta, An Giang and Dong Tap. And we are focusing for now in our project on adaptation planning for rice farmers in this area. And explicitly, we are for now focusing solely on profit, which is basically the difference in income from the rice minus the cost for fertilizer. And we're aggregating that at a district level just to get on top of the multiplicity of aspects and dimensions that you have in this situation. And we are considering the situation between 2002 and up to 2050. And just to give you a sense of what's happening here is, you see these two maps from 2002 and 2011, and focus on the green areas in this map. What you'll see is that there's a massive increase in triple rice farming. And triple rice farming means that you construct higher dikes that prevent the monsoon floods from entering the fields. And because of that, you can have a third cropping season in a year. And that actually gives rise to higher income. But you're also making yourself much more vulnerable because the monsoon floods are not only bad, they also bring nutrients, for example, and they can wash out all kinds of diseases. And basically, in between 2002 and 2011, strongly driven by government policy, there has been massive increases in these high dikes, giving rise to more potential for triple rice farming. And the Vietnam government is now stepping away from this policy because of all the unintended consequences that this policy is having. We are going to apply an approach called robust decision making. This was developed by Rob Lampert and colleagues at the RAND Corporation and is sort of a canonical example of how to use exploratory modeling to design policies under deep uncertainty, acting on complex systems. And the approach basically is you start with a problem specification, you determine a bunch of policy alternatives, you assess the performance of these policy alternatives over a large number of computational experiments or scenarios, and then you try to find patterns in those scenarios, or you want to reveal vulnerabilities of your policy, And then in light of that, iteratively, you can improve those policies. It is quite typical for something like robust decision making to structure the decision information using something which is known as the XLRM diagram. And here you see that basically we specify the exogenous uncertainties, the policy options, the relationships within the system, in this case represented by a model, and the outcomes of interest, that about which we care. So let's use this to structure the information that we have for the Vietnam Mekong Delta case that we're looking at. First of all, we're using a multisectoral dynamics metamodel. And with metamodel, we mean a theory-informed metamodel. So basically, we are using detailed models. We simplify the schematization, but we keep the core theoretical relations from these models. And if you want to know more, there's a paper by Marjolein Haasnoot and others published in 2014 that dives into that in much greater detail for a case study in the Netherlands. So let's look at this model in a little bit more detail. We are considering here flooding and sedimentation, land use change, the nutrient stocks and crop yields, and out of that comes the farmer profitability. And we have on the one hand environmental or natural systems like flooding, sedimentation, nutrient stocks and crop yield. On the other hand, we have a purely socioeconomic component, namely the farmer profitability. And then we have land use change, which is sort of a hybrid and is critical in combining all these pieces of information together. We are building extensively on a lot of earlier work. So for example, we have statistical relations on land subsidence derived from earlier work. We have information on flood risk and water depths from earlier work. We have information on sediment deposition. We have a simplified model for crop yields. And then we ourselves are developing this cellular automata-based land use change model in which land use is changing over time, given profitability, given suitability, and giving demand for certain types of land use. Then there's a bunch of uncertain factors that we are considering. In this case, we look at upstream discharge. And for that, we use information provided from PCR GLOB. We look at upstream dam construction, and specifically we are representing that by a trapping efficiency parameter, again based on earlier work. And then we have a variety of scenarios for land use demand, basically business as usual, a shift back to double rice cropping, which partly is inspired by current policy initiatives at the national level in Vietnam, more urbanization, or a transition to non-rice agriculture. And for example, when we visited the Mekong Delta for our field visit last time, you saw the emergence of a lot of fruit farming. So that's the type of scenario you have to think of. We are also considering a number of different policy options, alone or in combination. Basically do nothing and just see what happens. We can provide subsidies basically such that farmers can buy fertilizer more easy based on distance from the river, or by focusing specifically on the poorest regions. We can either add more high dikes, so increase the triple rice cropping dynamic, or remove a lot of the high dikes, shifting back to double rice cropping. And there are some ideas on changing the rice variety. These are sort of first examples of the types of policies that you can look at. And what we're doing in this particular case is that we sample over the uncertainties and the policies using a factorial design. And we're running this multisectoral dynamics model over 40,000 times, representing different combinations of uncertain developments and different combinations of policy options. And out of that comes the outcomes of interest, which in this particular case is the average annual profit at the district level. So basically we are producing over 40,000 of these maps specifying the profitability in our case study area. Clearly, we have to make sense of all these results. So as a first step, we are clustering these maps such that we get sort of exemplary patterns. And here you see 7 clusters with sort of the median map from each of the clusters. And you see quite different patterns of development. So the darker green is more profitability, the lighter green is poorer. And we see areas where sort of the middle part of the map is more profitable, and that's actually close to the river. But we also have maps where, for example, the downstream part at the right-hand corner, like cluster 4, becomes most profitable. And we also see patterns where regions a little bit further away from the river are most profitable. The next step then is to ask, okay, given all these different patterns of development, under what combination of uncertain factors and or policy options, or combinations of policy options, do these patterns occur? And this is known basically as scenario discovery in the literature. And in this particular case, we are using a classification tree to do that. And the way you look at this is there are three colors here. So green are the policy options, blue are uncertain factors, and then the yellow are the resulting nodes. And you read this from the top to the bottom. So for example, starting from the top, if we introduce the fertilizer to poor regions as a policy option, if that is true, and lowering dikes is true, we end up in the left-hand side, node 1, and dominant cluster number 3. And if we go through this tree, we see basically different combinations of policy options, possibly in interaction with uncertainties that give rise to a particular cluster. So for example, we could do fertilizer to the poor, let that be false. Let fertilizer on the outskirts or further away from the river be true, and heightening dikes is true. The dominant cluster then becomes cluster 2. And we see that that cluster is not really sensitive to all the uncertainties. However, if we go down from fertilizer outskirts to heightening dikes is false, so only do fertilizer on the outskirts, then dam construction becomes relevant. And then if the dam construction is small, so there is not a lot of upstream development of dams and not a lot of sediment trapping upstream, we would get node 5 and the dominant cluster is 2. And if that is false, so if there is quite some sediment trapping, we get the cluster 4. And this actually provides us with a lot of information that is possibly decision relevant. First of all, we get a sense of how different combinations of policies can be used to achieve certain patterns of development. And so far, I haven't said anything about which of these patterns of development is desirable or undesirable. This is largely a discussion to be had with policymakers, which due to COVID, of course, is hard for us to do at the moment. But imagine that you want to achieve a pattern of development like like cluster, the first cluster, dominant cluster 1, so that is node 6 in this thing. Basically, what we can read off this tree is that we would apply the fertilizer on the outskirts. We don't do any dike heightening, then we get there. So by just providing a specific targeted fertilizer policy, we can already achieve the particular pattern of development. If, however, we do combine that with heightening dikes, so we go down the right-hand branch of the tree, and the dam construction is small, we again arrive at cluster 0. Excuse me. So what does this tell us? Basically, this gives us a pathway. We can start by providing fertilizer. Imagine still that we want to pursue cluster 0. We can start by providing fertilizers to the outlying regions further away from the river. We don't do anything with the dikes yet, but instead we monitor what happens with this upstream sediment trapping. And if upstream sediment trapping becomes or stays quite small, we can decide to add heightening dikes. So now we are building a pathway of sequences of actions to be taken over time. So let me wrap up. There's sort of 3 take-home messages from what I just talked about. First of all, when we're interested in complex policy issues like migration in the Vietnam Mekong Delta, we have to consider multisectoral dynamics because these phenomena emerge out of complex co-evolutionary dynamics in these multisectoral systems. To come to grips with the intrinsic complexity and uncertainty of multisectoral dynamics, we have to adopt an exploratory modeling approach. The combination of complexity and uncertainty basically means that we cannot pretend that we can accurately predict what these systems will be doing 10, 20 years in the future. And instead, by systematically exploring what might happen, we're in a much better position to prepare policies. And finally, adaptive pathways provides us with a natural means of navigating such an uncertain future because it allows us to select promising policies, sequence them over time, and make their implementation conditional on how the future is actually unfolding. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. We are going live. And so I really would like to really thank all of our speakers because we are split over 3 continents and it's the middle of the night for Dr. Oki. And so really thanking all the speakers for their outstanding presentation. I would also like to thank all of the attendees in those uncertain times. Thank you so much for making the science come first. And I'd also like to mention and acknowledge Dr. Yoshihide Wada and Klaus Keller, who are the co-governors and have been helping a lot in the background to manage a lot of your questions. So we have a number of questions for the attendees. It's been a very lively discussions on the side. The speakers have been attending some. The first question would be for Dr. Oki. The first question is the questions are both from Pat Reed and John Lamontagne. The question was, how do you see our ability to capture key differences in water institution and governance as we try to better understand food, energy, and water and interdependencies? And how should we model or think about those institutions and how they may change in the future to adapt to emerging scarcity? I cannot hear you. No, we cannot hear you.
Oh, sorry. Okay.
We do.
Sorry that I didn't check the chat. Actually, okay. So can I respond a little later? Sorry.
What about if you want? So you can go through the chat. There was the question from Dr. Reed and Lamontagne. There was also a question from Stephen Chan. Let me put them back on the chat because the chat became very lively.
It is. Do you hear me now?
Yeah, we do.
Okay. So would you please, somebody else will answer first, then I will think about that. Okay.
That sounds good. What the other question was for let me see on my list. Julie, I think you started. You had some answers already. The first question was, what advances are needed to better understand and prioritize intervention as they pose very contextually specific benefits and risk across short and long time scale. You started responding on this. Do you want to dig deeper and also address the other question from Pat Reed on your perspective on water institutions and governance given their atypical nature?
Yeah, on the first question, I liked some of Jan's answers on the fact that we need to be able to zoom in and out. The big struggle for me has been that I'm asked all the time for high-level prioritization across sectors, across infrastructure investments versus other types of interventions. And it's really hard to find models that can represent everything in a simple way and yet give interesting insights. Because then you end up using those macroeconomic models that represent the economy as one sector and everything is linear and nothing ever happens. And if you shock the system, it goes back to that equilibrium systematically very quickly. And so, yeah, I've been struggling. What people do in that case is that then they don't use model, but they use benchmarking exercises. So they look for indicators that will be a good proxy for their objectives, and then they will benchmark the country they're interested in against other countries. Again, we're limited in the indicators we can use to whatever is available for everyone, and then looking at what other countries are doing is not necessarily a good objective, especially for things like climate change adaptation, which are new for everyone. So
I don't have a good answer, but being able to have those quick high-level models that can then give you a link to the more sectoral or more detailed systems models would be extremely useful. On what questions that I don't have a good answer. It's a difficult question.
As we get back to Dr. Oki, I'm just going, because of your answer, if you don't mind, I'd like to get back to Dr. Quackle, because this is what he addressed in his presentation with a high-level and multisectoral model. So, Dr. Quackle, you were starting, I know you started discussing the new modeling approaches to go from a high level and then to go to multiple sectors. And you also addressed in your presentation on how you start with benchmark, but they change a lot from one place to another. So how flexible and generalizable is your approach? How did you go around this so that you can really draw and understand multisector dynamics in such a diversity of context?
So there's a couple of thoughts on that. First, the theory-informed meta-modeling approach, which we used in the Vietnam study. We have been using that in a variety of other case studies, including similar questions in Bangladesh, but also in the Netherlands. We're doing some work actually with the World Bank for Beira, where we're using this approach. So I think that idea works reasonably well at the moment. What we cannot do at the moment is this idea of zooming in and zooming out. So we start from the detailed models. We combine that with what we know theoretically. And in that way, we manually develop our more high-level models. In theory, you could take the results from our model and then have a closer look in detail with the existing detailed models. But all of that is really, really hard work, painful, and not easy. So if there is, I think, an important research frontier, then it is here. So what kind of tooling can we develop to make it easier to develop these multisectoral dynamics models? So that's step one. And step two is, once we are talking about that kind of tooling, how can we deal with the multi-resolution question? And I do personally think that if there is a community that starts collaborating on the type of infrastructure you need for these types of models, that would be tremendously valuable.
Okay. So just following this link here, now we're talking about different tools that we need to go from very detailed. Typically, it's associated with one specific region, and then we need to go to a high level, and we need to go to multisector dynamics. So my next question is actually for Dr. Moss, in terms of what are the educational, what are the new type of expertise, the new way of working together, so that we can reach this level of expertise and develop those tools and be able to interpret them as well.
Thanks, Natalie. That's a really great question. And, I put a short answer in the chat, which, involves, I think, providing opportunities for people to work in transdisciplinary teams. And what I mean by transdisciplinary is it's not just multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary, but it's really, realizing that as you formulate questions and approaches for answering them in these kinds of transdisciplinary settings, you have to be open to seeing changes in your own discipline and how your own discipline works. And you also need to be really open, I think, to getting input from things that in the academic community we may not think of traditionally as disciplines, but areas of professional practice, as well as from stakeholders themselves who understand what drives change in these systems, what the tipping points might be, and other information that we really have to have if we're going to be able to model effectively. And working in transdisciplinary teams, I think, is really challenging for people, particularly for young people and early career folks. And I think it's something that we really have to provide coursework, think of ways of going beyond just kind of a standard academic approach to conveying this. It really needs to be the experience of working in these teams.
And thank you. So that makes it come back to Dr. Oki's presentation. And this is something that we saw through all of the presentation. There is a technical aspect, which a lot of us are more familiar and comfortable with. And then there is really the role of institution and the culture. How you set up the different model is really associated with the values of the different regions. In Dr. Oki's presentation, there was a lot of, there was a global perspective, right? And so maybe it's unrelated to the question, but how do you see the ability to capture water institution and governance through food, energy, and water interdependency? And you have a global perspective. There are also regional perspective. How to think about the role of institutions and implement them across scale. Dr. Oki.
Sorry, who are you asking?
Yes.
Yeah, I
Thank you
realized
very
I was asking, sorry, I was asking Dr. Oki.
Okay, thank you. So that the well, for that the question from the Patrick Reed, I'm not quite sure that whether I fully understand his question, but together with the question from the Jonathan Lamontage, that the probably we can assume that all these institutions and governance should be optimized somehow to better manage that water resources, and also together with the interconnection with the food and energy. But I think that the from my experience in the modeling, numerical modeling of that, how that human interventions on water cycle can be modeled, that as a first order approximation, we can assume that, okay, people and institutions behave from the very much optimum choices they select. So, alternatives, but if that their behavior is slightly or that largely different from that optimum choices, then we can evaluate that how that institutions are far from that beta state. So from that, I think we can assess that the key differences in the water institutions by that kind of the analysis and also the assessment. Thank you very much.
Perfect, thank you. I think there was another question from Stephen Chan on, let me say, it is quite obvious from your presentation that water is directly or indirectly traded and transported across borders. And so would putting an international pricing and market for water be constructive or deconstructive to deal with water trade? And I think it could be related to what's next in your research, basically.
Yeah, I think that I answered in the question and answers already, but as a parent from the presentation, my presentation, that virtual water trade flows from relatively water-rich nation to water-scarce nation in general, and alleviates the water scarcity and should be promoted, provided if that all the external environmental costs associated with the water uses are fully accounted in the price of the traded products such as food. Thank you very much.
Perfect. So the next question, and thank you for putting this in the chat. I'd like to have our four presenters go one after the other So I would say, I'll just follow, I have Dr. Kwako, then Dr. Julie, then Dr. Moss, and then Dr. Oki, just following the order on my screen. You all have gone through your presentations and you had technical needs. And so what are the boundaries? We're talking about what are the boundaries of the multi-sector dynamics field? And I will ask the question differently. What are your current needs? What is it that you could not address with the existing tools where you think that multi-sector dynamics is going to address your questions? What are you think the different approach that need to emerge so that they can help with all of your with your research and the specific science question you were after?
So that's a really, really big question that you put on the table right there.
Yeah.
So the first one I sort of already said in a previous response, which is work on the tooling side of things. Groups that engage in multisectoral dynamics often glue stuff together in their own ad hoc way. And it is hard to make that work even a few months later. So I think that is one, tooling. And that the same extends actually to the analyses like the ones I was showing. There is an emerging community in which we share these types of tooling, but I think there are still many, many open issues there as well. Just to directly relate this to my own presentation, I was talking about policy pathways, but I was pretending as if there is a single planner that can plan the development, the pathway for this entire region, which of course in reality is not the case. Typically you have a variety of actors involved that have their own development pathways that are interacting in complex ways, and there's a need for coordination. So I think one important challenge specifically to this policy pathway idea is how to deal with multiple interacting pathways, how to facilitate and coordinate the realization of these different pathways, and also how to ensure stability and trust. If I make a decision today to do something conditional on you doing something tomorrow, and I get very, very bad outcomes if you don't do that tomorrow, what's going to happen? So those types of really social dilemmas that you then get, both from the analytic side of things, how do we get to grips with those? How do we analyze that? I think that is another key issue when you talk about multisectoral dynamics and supporting decision-making about multisectoral dynamics.
Thank you. Dr. Rosenberg?
For me, I would say that there's a need to bridge the gap between the engineering community and natural sciences and social sciences. I've been trying to work a lot recently in small island developing states in the Pacific and in the Caribbean with this project. And yes, there is a need to model the links between sea level rise and infrastructure systems and saltwater intrusion and agriculture. But then we don't actually understand why people make the decisions to live where they live. For this, we need historical perspectives. We need to look at cultural aspects. And I think that even if we come with very robust policy recommendations, it's very unclear that they will actually be implemented and that they will have any sort of impact, because we don't understand land ownership dynamics, and those can be very complicated in some of those small island nations. So I've rarely seen these kinds of collaborations between social scientists, and I've been pushing for collaboration between engineers and economists for all my career. I've been trying to do that, but I think that pushing further into other kinds of social sciences would be really useful.
Thank you. Dr. Moss?
Yeah, I resonate strongly with those first two comments. I'll just add, I think incorporating different aspects of governance into our understanding of how to model governance in these systems, it's really crucial. Also, I think developing and continuing to advance in hierarchical modeling, where we can represent with different levels of complexity the processes that we see underway at different scales. I think that's another real challenge. And finally, uncertainty characterization, which one of the questions pointed to in the Q&A channel. I just think that's also really critical.
Excellent. Dr. Olke.
Thank you. I have nothing special for the future tool development, but I would think that for example, the database development, even though that is basically based on the qualitative narratives or just the descriptions, but still that if we develop more, if we have record more than 100, we can really quantitatively and can be used as an statistical analysis or whatever in conjunction with the other indices of the happiness or that the conflicts, etc. So such an database development, I think we need based on the literature survey or the interviews. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you so much for your answer. I think we had a great presentation. We had a lot of questions with respect to multi-sector dynamics, and please check on the AGU agenda, where we have other more technical sessions that affect how to approach multi-sector dynamics. What is our visions of the new tools? What are the current advances, or what are the current roadblocks? And we also have an upcoming special issue on Earth futures. So thank you so much again. This was a brilliant session. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.